Gasping, Kallan fell back against the door. With her fist clenched, she pressed her fingers against her mouth, willing herself calm as she battled back the urge to break beneath her anger. Upstairs, the festivities had begun, and she cringed at the concept of joining them. Collecting her strength, Kallan huffed and pulled herself up, not bothering to straighten her skirts. She trudged back through the prison, all the while resisting the impulse to run to the stables and Astrid. She dropped the keys to the gimping guard, who she found in the armory, and then shuffled into the hallway before turning down the corridor toward the great hall, away from Astrid and the prisons. The scent of pine, sweet mead, and roasted pork wafted from the hall. Song and merriment accompanied endless bouts of laughter that failed to move her. From the corridor, Kallan stood in the shadows and watched the festivities. Her warmen had gathered around the tables. There they exchanged food and drink with endless stories of their courageous deeds, while they picked clean the 3 roast pigs extended over the fire pits. A year ago she would have led them on in this merriment, being the first to boast their victory in battle. This day, 'twas all she could do not to run away without a glance back. Across the hall in the sea of heads, Gudrun's golden eyes found her. The old woman smiled warmly, and Kallan knew her grandmother had already advised the guests of the queen's absence, permitting Kallan the isolation she craved. Flooded with gratitude, Kallan attempted a weak smile back, trudging away from the feast and down the hall. In silence she made her way through the labyrinth of corridors, up several sets of stairs, and as far around the great hall and its festival as possible. At last she reached the floor of her chambers. Even there she could smell the food and drink. As Kallan made her final turn, she stopped abruptly at the sight of Dagon, calm and patient, at the end of the hall where he waited in front of her chamber door. Kallan glided down the corridor. Her gown swept the floor. In masquerade she glistened, steeped in a chill that clung to her frigid complexion. The subtle glint of Kira's pendant caught Dagon's eye, and a twinge of remorse tugged at his chest. "Kallan," he said, taking her hand as she arrived at her chamber door. He studied her empty face. The only warmth was of the lantern light glowing back at him from the wall. Beyond that, her eyes, iced from the void and weighted with the flood of his grief, consumed her. Too plainly he saw the broken queen of Gudrun had spoken of, an empty vessel, chilled by a death that was taking her. Dagon turned over her tiny palms. "Your hands are warm," he said, half expecting them to be as cold as the guise she wore. She pulled her hand free, as if afraid he could sense the shadows haunting her through the torch. "'Tis nothing," she said, forcing her fake grin wider. With a sentinel's eye, Dagon followed, as she pushed her way to her chamber door. "All is in order," she said. "Tonight my people feast, but tomorrow the king dies." Her words fell like snow, sending a chill that churned Dagon's stomach. He caught her hand as Kallan reached for the door handle. His armband flashed in the light as he moved. Dagon pulled her face to his, and looked at Kallan as she stared through her mask of mock joy. "Why so cold, Kallan?" he whispered. Tears flooded Kallan's eyes at the word. Through depleted strength, Dagon looked into the darkness holding her, binding her to its fate, just out of reach. In silence she pleaded, begging him to reach in, to pull her from the void, and all at once she understood, and wrapped his arms around the girl. He held her, desperate to keep her there, the more she slipped away. "Will you never grave?" he whispered, and Kallan tightened her arms around his wide ribs. Sighing, Dagon planted a kiss on the top of her head, and released her after giving a gentle squeeze to her shoulder. Without a word, he turned to walk the length of the corridor and round the corner out of sight. Several moments passed where Kallan stood numb in the hall. She waited until she was certain her legs would give out from exhaustion. Sighing deeply, Kallan pushed open the door of her chambers and swept inside her sitting room. The door had barely latched closed when the hurried footsteps of a child thumped along the floor, pulling a grin across Kallan's face like a beam of starlight touching down on moonflowers. "Cowan!" Rune cried, and did her best to leap the whole 3 inches into the air and land in Kallan's arms. "Rind!" Kallan exclaimed, scooping up the toddler in a long and tight hug. "Oh, Rind, dearest Rind!" Kallan squeezed the child, releasing her doubts, her worries, her trifles, as she rocked the child in her arms. "Oh, I missed you!" After a moment, Kallan tightened her hug. "Where is Elif, But the child had wasted no time shoving her little thumb into her mouth and nestling her head onto Kallan's shoulder. "Elif!" Kallan called, glancing around her chambers once she saw that Rune wouldn't answer. A platter of meats and cheese with a bowl of cloudberries caught her eye, and Kallan grinned wider as Elif shuffled into view on the balcony. "I'm here," Elif said, poking his head around the corner. With Rune still slumped against her shoulder, as Kallan stepped out onto the balcony and at once began swaying in place beside Elif. She would not go to sleep tonight after hearing you were back, Elif grinned, looking back to the sea. She just wouldn't have it. And how did she know I was back? Kallan asked, grinning widely with an arched brow to Elif. Latha, Rune said, through the thumb in her mouth. Latha, Kallan mused, and gazed again to Elif. How is Latha? Never better. And Herdis and Cree? Kallan asked, so excited she debated on heading down to the Warrens almost at once. They all wanted to come, but I held off the rabble with promises that you would be down to see them tomorrow, Elif said. He gazed from the sea and shifted his brown-eyed plea to Kallan, who could only grin wider. Well then, I suppose I will have to be down first thing in the morning, won't I? How's that sound, Rind? Rind was already nodding. Promise? Rind asked around her thumb. Smiling, Kallan removed the white elding bracelet from her wrist and slipped it onto Rind's. I promise, Kallan whispered as Rind settled back down, turning the bracelet over to study its intricate designs. How well did the supplies last? Kallan asked, gazing up at the dwindling crescent moon. We made them last, Elif assured her, and pulled his eyes from the sky. You've already done more than your share, Kallan. I can always do more, she said, as the crescent vanished behind a wall of thick cloud. Returning to the sitting room, Kallan sat herself in the chair stationed in front of her desk, ensuring she could still see the sea in the distance. Elif followed right behind, as Kallan shifted Rind into a better position on her lap. Caedwyn? The child pulled her thumb from her mouth, long enough to plop her head into Kallan's chest. Can you tell me a story? Her large eyes looked up at Kallan and waited. A story. Kallan shifted a glance to Elif, who could only grin in response as he made himself comfortable against the wall. Well, only if you promise to go to sleep. Rind nodded and stared off into nothing and listened, waiting for Kallan to begin. The fire crackled and popped against the breeze of sea air, and Kallan exhaled, finding her temporary peace within. She thought for a moment and looked to the sky looming over her balcony. The cloud shifted again, revealing the moon's crescent, and then, with a soft grin on her lips, Kallan began the children's riddle. Yuki and Beal chased the moon with water from Brigir's well. Upon their shoulders they did share, Simu the pole and Seg. Mani they cried and chased the sky from Brigir whence we came, to water the earth and water your drink and water the seas with rain. Rin nestled closer into Kallan and closed her eyes filled with dreams as Kallan continued. Hati looked back and scolded ahead, but Mani gave no reply, for Yuki he took and bent his crook and Bill was taken thereafter. Yuki and Beal still chased the moon from Brigir whence they came, to water the earth and water the drink and water the seas with rain. The hearth fire crackled, and Kallan risked a glance down to the sleeping Rind. Her thumb hung lazily in her mouth. Without a word they sat there, and the two of them as Rind slept, listening only to the winds and waves of the sea, and the crackling hearth fire as they took in the warm scent of the feast downstairs. And for that moment, for that breathless moment, everything seemed right with the world.